Bam, bam, bam. Vamos. Hey, what's up, Richard? Bro, you got off yesterday. You didn't even wait for us to get to play again. We April and I played for like 6 more games, bro. We won 1 of them. He said you must have fallen asleep. Playing some solo ransom. What? Nah, bro. It was only Isaac. ¿Qué pasó? What? Bull crap, man. I was supposed to win that. That's crap. And did your network cut off too? Bull crap.
Thank you Hilvia Mercado for joining.
Y'all can still see me.
Thank you Lica de la Rosa for joining. Thank you All Mario has 2 for joining. Thank you Latino 100 for joining. Thank you Liliana Reacts 07 for joining. Thank you Genevieve Romero 21 for joining. Thank you Urger Lili for joining. Thank you Elda Viniegra 7 for joining. Thank you Mercedes, Rito64 for joining. Thank you Amelia Cordelia.ttv for joining. Thank you Nanny Diaz 565 for joining. Thank you Endem Kanye West 1977 for joining. Thank you Coke BSR9IH for joining. Thank you Bertade Torres for joining. Thank you Mimid 3 Bra for joining. Thank you C Morales for joining. Thank you DRDR 599 for joining. Thank you Abranian for joining.
Bro, I took a shower. My
Thank you
AirPods
Mojica 6 for joining. Thank you Rhinita 499 for joining. Thank you Graciela Portillo 59 for joining. Thank you Luisa Opera 20 for joining. Thank you Torres Rugama 2022 for joining. Thank you Luisa Miv for joining. Thank you Avelia Zamora 06 for joining. Thank you Melanie Moraine for joining. Thank you Anthony Rodriguez 845 for joining. Thank you Audio 913 for joining. Thank you Laura Hernandez 672 for joining. Thank you DLD 1986 for joining. Thank you Maria R for joining. Thank you Isael Flores 395 for joining. Thank you Anna Sirlee for joining. Thank you Palwinder 2nd for joining. Thank you Elizabeth Cruz 7499 for joining. Thank you Chaleander 899 for joining. Thank you Alacana for 74 for joining. Thank you Patricia Moreno 52 for joining. Thank you S. Chantal for joining. Thank you Dasne Designs for joining. Thank you Evaldo 1832 for joining. Thank you Yasiel 1961 for joining. Thank you DYH5DPFF2V4 for joining. Thank you Vanessa Narvaez 1992 for joining. Thank you EO Crochet for joining. Thank you Floptropica 796 for joining. Thank you Marilyn Santana 120 for joining. Thank you Rosariaga 58 for joining. Thank you Patton TPP1Z3 for joining. Thank you General Thugnuts for joining. Thank you Maria 7871 for joining. Thank you Cindy Santo 4 for joining. Thank you Melishu 29 for joining. Thank you Andres Camarena 7 for joining. Thank you Kate Press for joining. Thank you Diana Vela 324 for joining. Thank you the Boys 5298 for joining. Thank you Suze Niages for joining. Thank you Infinite Bear for joining. Thank you Johnny and Carol for joining. Thank you Elizabeth Mata 004 for joining. Thank you Delfino Gonzalez 41 for joining. Thank you Nina Babina 326 for joining. Thank you D Trevino 59 for joining. Thank you Lily Vega in the House Baby for joining. Thank you Beer Avila 27 for joining. Thank you Sandra Martinez 0513 for joining. Thank you Leslie Hubbard Byrne for joining. Thank you Rafael Espinoza 747 for joining. Thank you Elemerdy 41 for joining. Thank you Concepcion Reyes 93 for joining. Thank you Baba Yaga 8182 for joining. Thank you Tita Vasks for joining. Thank you Fluvial MS1 for joining. Thank you Barbara Temple 38 for joining. Thank you Martha Zelaya 88 for joining. Thank you Melissa Salazar 4302 for joining. Thank you So 10 Levels for joining. Thank you Innocentia 1974 for joining. Thank you Amanda Salazar RRR for joining. Thank you Noemi 60 for joining. Thank you Miraj Gillespie for joining. Thank you Letty Vengar for joining. Thank you Tigra 450 for joining. Thank you Missy 0610 for joining. Thank you Sylvia Bocanegra 3 for joining. Thank you Berthabara Hizbask for joining. Thank you Ana Maria Gonzal 7 for joining. Thank you Fortnite Skin God for joining. Thank you Marier for joining. Thank you Land of Z 6 kilograms for joining.
Oh, what's up?
Thank you Fortnite Skin God for 21 likes. Thank you Anna Maria Gonzal 7 for joining. Thank you Fortnite Skin God for 89 likes. Thank you Elizabeth Ama 3 for joining. Thank you Jojoke for joining. Thank you Maria Galdames 038 for joining. Thank you Mailingles for joining.
¡Órale! Pum.
Thank you Araceli Ruano 7 for joining.
Hola, Araceli Ruano. Saludos.
Thank you Claudia P. Sanchez 59 for joining. Thank you Yanira Duran 10 for joining. Thank you Ari Gutierrez Bouquets for joining. Thank you It's My Afop for joining.
Ese menos rápido.
Thank you Tyler, S188 for joining.
Esa la luz del que maté.
Thank you Slap Money for joining. Thank you Estrella Ibarra 502 for joining. Thank you Arnulfo Gonzalez 51 for joining. Thank you Alfredo Luna 530 for joining. Thank you Lesidona for joining. Thank you It's Mayafop for joining. Thank you Maria Ramirez 0214 for joining. Thank you Roida 6754 for joining. Thank you Esaglow for joining.
Hola, Gloria.
Thank you Rosa, Aragon 76 for joining. Thank you Dariella.is.not, here for joining. Thank you Rosa Alvarado 2638 for joining.
Ah,
Thank you High and Lifted Up 007 for joining.
Moving on. I am lifted up.
Thank you Mariah Werda 249 for joining.